He was 58 years old, standing alone in a field that had swallowed his best years whole, when she walked into his life and made him feel like a fool for still being alive. Not because she was cruel, because she was kind. And kindness, after 11 years of silence, was the most dangerous thing in the world. This is the story of a man who had already buried his future, and the woman who refused to let him keep it in the ground. If this story moves you, hit like and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this one travels. Now let's begin. The ranch didn't look like failure. That was the cruelest part. From the road, if you could call it that, more of a rutted scar cut through frozen grass. The Thornton spread looked like something a man could be proud of. 340 acres of high Montana plain, the kind of land that didn't give itself to you easily, but held fast once you earned it. A main house built from timber Elias had milled himself, back when his back cooperated and his hands were steadier. A barn red as an open wound against the gray November sky. 2 bunkhouses that sat mostly empty now, except during branding season when he hired day workers from town. Fences that needed mending every spring and got mended every spring, because Elias Thornton was nothing if not a man who fixed what broke, except the things he couldn't. He was up before dawn on the morning everything began to change. The way he was up before dawn every morning had been for going on 30 years. The Montana cold in November wasn't polite about announcing itself. It came through the window cracks and under the door, and straight through the walls if the wind was at the right angle, which it usually was. He pulled on his boots, sitting on the edge of the same bed he'd slept in for 3 decades, the left side of which had been empty for 11 years. He didn't look at the left side anymore. He had learned, eventually, not to look. The coffee was bad. It was always bad. He couldn't quite figure out what Ruth had done differently, whether it was the amount of grounds or the heat of the water, or just some patience he didn't possess. But he drank it anyway, standing at the window over the kitchen sink, watching the dark field slowly separate itself from the dark sky as morning came up gray and reluctant over the mountains. Elias Thornton at 58 looked like what he was, a man built by work. Not tall, not particularly impressive at a glance, but broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that spoke of decades of physical labor rather than vanity. His face was weathered past the point of reading his age accurately. You might have guessed 65, or you might have guessed 50, depending on the light and whether he was smiling, which he mostly wasn't. His hair had gone fully white sometime in his late 40s, and he'd let it because there was nobody to cut it for, and he trimmed it himself badly every few months. His hands were the hands of a man who had spent his life using them, scarred across the knuckles, permanently stained at the cuticles with something no amount of washing fully removed. He was, by every measure that counted in Harlan County, Montana, a solid man, a good neighbor, a fair employer during the seasons he needed help. He paid his debts and minded his business. He showed up when the Hendersons lost their hay barn to a lightning fire 3 years ago and didn't ask for anything in return. He kept his fences. He kept his word. He had simply, somewhere along the way, stopped expecting anything to happen to him. That was the quiet truth of his life in the year 1887. Not misery, exactly. Not the dramatic suffering of a man in a novel, just the slow, settled weight of a life that had reached its natural ceiling and accepted it. He woke up, he worked, he ate, he slept. Sometimes he sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the light change over the mountains until the cold drove him inside. He didn't drink too much. He didn't cause trouble. He went to town when he needed supplies, and he came back the same day, and he did it all over again. Ruth had been dead for 11 years. She'd gone fast, which people told him was a mercy, and he supposed in the abstract they were right. But mercy felt like the wrong word for the experience of coming home from the East pasture one October afternoon to find your wife on the kitchen floor with the dinner half made on the stove. And the mercy, if it existed at all, was not something he could locate in his chest in any practical way. They'd had no children. That was a grief that had lived between them for years before she died, one they'd made a kind of peace with, or something that resembled peace when you squinted at it. He had poured everything into the ranch instead, into the land, into the work that never ran out, the endlessly renewable resource of physical labor, which had the considerable advantage of not requiring you to feel anything while you were doing it. He finished the bad coffee. He rinsed the cup. He went out to feed the horses. Elias heard about the new school teacher the way he heard about most things in Harlan County, which was to say, He heard about her 3 weeks after everyone else did, and only because Walt Greer mentioned her while they were both standing at the counter at Halverson's general store waiting for Halverson to finish counting out change. "You meet the new teacher yet?" Walt said, not particularly directing it at Elias, just talking the way Walt talked, which was continuously and about everything. "I haven't been introduced," Elias said. "Hartwell. Vivian Hartwell. Came down from Billings? Or maybe Missoula. I can't keep it straight. Young woman, maybe 28, 29, real educated." Walt accepted his change from Halverson and pocketed it. "Clarence Hooper's already sniffing around, so is young Peterson from the lumber mill." "Good for them," Elias said. Walt gave him a look that contained something between amusement and mild pity. "You know, Elias, you don't have to die out there on that ranch." "I'm not dying," Elias said. "I'm working." "Same thing," after a while. Halverson slid Elias's order across the counter, and Elias loaded it into his arms, ending the conversation the way he usually ended conversations about his personal life, which was to simply stop participating in them. He met her 4 days later, and it was nothing like a story. He had driven the wagon in for a load of lumber, some fencing material, and a few boards for patching the north wall of the barn where the weather had worked its way in. And he was coming out of the lumber yard with the wagon loaded when he almost ran her over. Not deliberately, not even through carelessness, just the ordinary chaos of a busy street, and a horse that spooked at a dog that ran under its legs. The wagon lurched. A woman stepped back sharply onto the boardwalk. The dog yelped and vanished. "Hell," Elias said, pulling the horse up. "I'm sorry. Are you all right?" The woman who turned to look at him was not what he expected, though he couldn't have said what he expected since he hadn't known he was about to meet anyone. She was medium height, dark-haired, wearing a coat that looked practical rather than fashionable, which he noticed only because most women in town wore coats that looked cold. She had the kind of face that made you look twice. Not pretty in the soft, delicate way that people usually meant when they called women pretty, but striking, direct. Her eyes were dark brown, and they assessed him with a flatness that he recognized as intelligence rather than rudeness. "I'm fine," she said. "Your horse has a good stopping instinct." He spooked. "I should have been watching better." The dog was moving fast. She glanced at the horse, which was still sidestepping nervously. "You want to let him settle before you drive further?" That surprised him. The practical suggestion from a woman he'd nearly run down, the absence of drama about it. "That's probably smart," he said. He climbed down from the wagon and stood at the horse's head, talking to him quietly, and she waited on the boardwalk in a way that suggested she wasn't in any particular hurry. After a moment, she said, "You're one of the ranchers. I've seen you in town a few times." "Elias Thornton," he said. "I'm out on the North Road about 4 miles. Vivian Hartwell." She didn't say she was the new school teacher. He would find that out later. "You have a big operation out there? Big enough for one man?" he said. "Not so big I can't manage it." She nodded, like that was an answer that made sense, which most people didn't think it was. Most people thought the answer called for some expression of either pride or apology. "I'd imagine that gets quiet," she said. "It does," he said. He wasn't sure why he admitted it. It was the sort of thing he didn't usually say. "But quiet isn't always bad." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." She paused. "But it can be, if it goes on long enough." He looked at her. She looked back at him, and there was something in it. Not flirtation, nothing so obvious, just the quality of a person who was actually present in the conversation, actually listening, which was rarer than it should have been. "I suppose that's true," he said. The horse had settled. There was no more reason to stand there. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Thornton," she said, and walked on down the boardwalk. He watched her go for exactly 1 second, which was already longer than he should have, and then he climbed back onto the wagon and headed home. That was the whole of it. A minute, maybe 2. Nothing happened. No thunderclap. No sudden warmth in his chest like the romances in the dime novels Ruth used to read described. He was a 58-year-old man standing in a cold street who had almost run over a woman and then had 4 sentences of conversation with her. He thought about it, though. Driving home along the North Road with the lumber shifting in the wagon bed, he thought about the direct way she'd looked at him, and the fact that she'd thought to mention the dog, and the practical observation about quiet that was also somehow not just practical. And then he caught himself thinking about it and made himself stop, because there was no reason to be thinking about a woman he'd spoken to for 2 minutes who was almost 30 years younger than him and had presumably come to Harlan County to build a life that had nothing to do with lonely ranchers who smelled like horses. He got home. He unloaded the lumber. He fed the animals. He ate a cold dinner standing at the kitchen counter because he hadn't thought to start anything before he left that morning. He told himself he wouldn't think about her again. It was Walt Greer who caused the second meeting, accidentally and without meaning to, which was characteristic of Walt. Walt showed up at the ranch on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later with a proposition about sharing use of a hay press for the late season cutting, which was reasonable enough that Elias let him come in for coffee despite the interruption to his morning. They sat at the kitchen table drinking the bad coffee and talking about hay and the coming winter and a dispute between the Halverson brothers about property lines that had been festering for 2 years, and eventually Walt said, "We're having a gathering at the church hall next Saturday. Social thing. Maybelle's been planning it." Elias made a non-committal sound. "She'll be there," Walt said, too casually. Elias looked at him. "Who?" "The teacher. Hartwell." Walt had the look of a man attempting innocence and failing. "Just mentioned it. No reason." "Walter?" "I'm just saying you could stand to get out more, Elias." "I get out plenty. To the lumberyard and the general store." "That's out?" "Maybelle says she's a real interesting woman. The teacher." Walt drank his coffee with the expression of a man who has committed to his position. "Reads a lot. Argues about things. Maybelle likes her." Elias did not respond to this. "You don't have to talk to anybody if you don't want to," Walt said. "You can stand in the corner like you usually do." "I don't stand in the corner." "You stand near the corner. I'm being generous." He did not go to the gathering with any intention of finding Vivian Hartwell. He went because he'd been going to the Greers' social gatherings for 20 years, and skipping them required more explanation than attending them, and he was not in the habit of explaining himself. He stood near the corner, near the wall, which was different, and drank the cider that was too sweet and watched his neighbors and thought about whether the north pasture fence line was going to hold through winter or whether he needed to reinforce it before the ground froze too hard to dig. She found him. He didn't expect that either. He was looking out the window at the dark street when she appeared at his elbow carrying her own cup of cider and said, "You look like someone doing math in their head." He turned, and the recognition was immediate, so her face, those direct dark eyes, and something in him did a thing it hadn't done in a while, which was become more alert. "Fence calculations," he said. She looked at him seriously for a moment and then laughed, and it wasn't a polished social laugh. It was an actual surprised one. "That's a new one. Most people claim to be thinking about the weather. The weather's less complicated than fencing on frozen ground." "Is it?" She turned slightly to look out the same window, and for a moment they were both just looking at the dark street together. "I wouldn't know. I'm still learning what complicated means out here." She paused. "It's different from what I expected." "What did you expect?" "I read about it." The corner of her mouth moved. "I read about it quite a bit, actually. Books are good at landscape. They're not as good at the thing where your water pump freezes at 4 in the morning and you have to figure out what to do about it." "That happened to you?" 3 weeks ago. I was up until 6 a.m. with a lamp and a blanket and a great deal of bad language." He looked at her. "Did you fix it?" "Eventually, I also nearly flooded the kitchen, but that resolved itself." It occurred to him that he was smiling. Not a large smile. He was out of practice with large smiles, but something in the vicinity of one. He couldn't remember the last time he'd done that without noticing it first. "Who taught you to handle the pump?" he said. "Nobody. I found a manual in the school's storage room from about 15 years ago. It was only partially wrong." "I could have a look at it," he heard himself say. "The pump, if you want it checked properly before it gets worse." She looked at him. That direct look. The one that didn't pretend not to be looking. "That's very kind," she said, and she meant it plainly without performance. "I'd appreciate that." They talked for another 20 minutes, maybe 25, and he couldn't have said exactly what they talked about. The school, some of it, a few of the families in the county whose children she was teaching, the peculiarities of Montana winter compared to what she'd experienced before, a book she'd been reading that she mentioned and he admitted he hadn't heard of, and she described it in a way that made him think he should look for it next time he was anywhere near a bookshop. which he wasn't very often, but still. At some point, Walt appeared at the edge of his vision with a look of insufferable satisfaction on his face, and Elias made a deliberate point of not looking at him. He drove home that night with the cold coming down hard and the horse moving fast to get back to the warmth of the barn, and he sat in his kitchen for a while in the dark. He didn't light the lamp, he didn't need to, and he thought about the way she had laughed, suddenly and without calculation, and the way she'd said that's a very kind without making it sound like something you were supposed to say. He went to look at her pump the following Tuesday. The pump was, in fact, badly maintained, and he spent an hour and a half on it while Vivian graded papers at the table 6 feet away and occasionally asked him questions about what he was doing, not to make conversation, but because she actually wanted to know how it worked. He explained it as clearly as he could, and she listened in the concentrated way she seemed to listen to everything, and by the time he was done, the pump was functioning and she had what appeared to be a genuine understanding of why it had failed and how to prevent the next failure. "I don't usually have students who take notes on plumbing," he said, washing his hands at the now working pump. "I don't usually have teachers who explain it as if they expect me to understand it," she said, and the way she said it told him that this had been, in her experience, unusual enough to notice. He stayed for coffee afterward, which she made considerably better than he made his own, and they talked for another hour in the small parlor of the house the school board provided her, which was crowded with books, stacked on the shelves, stacked on the floor, stacked on the windowsill with apparent indifference to the risk of frost damage, and he felt, for reasons he could not cleanly articulate, more comfortable than he had felt in another person's space for longer than he could clearly remember. He went back the following week to check that the repair was holding. It was. But they talked for 2 hours. He didn't analyze it. He was not a man given to extensive internal examination of his own behavior, which was, he was beginning to suspect, both a strength and a significant failure, depending on the situation. He went back because it was a reasonable thing to check. He stayed because the conversation was, he didn't have a clean word for it. Real was the closest he could get. It felt real in a way that most of his conversations didn't, which he might once have attributed to living alone too long and getting out of the habit of people, but which he was starting to suspect had more to do with her specifically. She asked him about on the ranch. Not politely, not the conversational asking that people did before they stopped listening, but actually with follow-up questions that demonstrated she'd retained what he'd said the time before. She asked about Ruth, gently, once, and he answered more than he'd intended to, and she didn't try to fix it or say the things people said, she just listened and then said, "It sounds like she was steady," which was the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about his wife in 11 years. He told her things he'd stopped expecting to tell anyone. She told him things too. Her family in Eastern Washington, a father who had opinions about everything and was wrong about half of it, but passionate about all of it, which she said with exasperation and also love. A younger brother who had gone to work on the railroads and wrote letters infrequently and badly. The years she'd spent studying, fighting for access to proper education at a time when proper education for women required fighting, which she described factually rather than with resentment, but the facts themselves were enough. "Why Harlan County?" he asked her one evening in late October, when the cold had sharpened into something serious. "There are schools closer to everything." She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he thought she might not answer. "I needed somewhere that wasn't connected to something I was leaving," she said finally. Montana seemed disconnected enough. He didn't ask what she was leaving. She'd tell him or she wouldn't, and he'd learned long ago that pushing at things people weren't ready to offer was a reliable way to lose them. "Fair enough," he said. She looked at him with something that might have been gratitude, not for the understanding, but for not asking. "Most people want the whole story immediately," she said. "Most people haven't lived long enough to know that the whole story takes a while." She was quiet again, but differently, like something had settled. "That's true," she said softly. Outside, the wind was working itself up into something, rattling the windows and pushing down the chimney, and the lamp on the table between them threw a circle of yellow light that made the room feel smaller and warmer than it was. And Elias Thornton sat in the warmth of it and thought very clearly and with a kind of quiet alarm, "This is the best I have felt in years." He rode home in the dark with the wind at his back and did not let himself examine what that meant. He should have known the town was watching. He always knew abstractly that Harlan County watched its own business the way a hawk watches a field, comprehensively, constantly, and with full intention of acting on what it saw. He'd just been outside the field for long enough that he'd forgotten he was visible. It was Clara Hooper who said it first, out loud, in a setting where it could be heard by enough people to constitute official county opinion. Clara was the wife of Clarence Hooper, who was also, as Walt had mentioned, one of the men who'd been angling for Vivian Hartwell's attention, and Clara's feelings about the situation were perhaps not entirely uncomplicated by that fact. "It's a shame," she said, at the counter of the general store, to Dorothy Halverson, in a voice pitched precisely to Carrie. "A young woman like Miss Hartwell, spending all her time out at Thornton's ranch. What can she possibly be thinking?" Dorothy Halverson, who was a more cautious woman, said something indistinct. "I'm not saying anything against Elias," Clara said, in the voice people use when they are absolutely saying something against someone. "He's a decent enough man. But there's decent and there's appropriate, isn't there? And a woman her age, unmarried, with prospects—" She left it hanging with the deliberateness of a person who has rehearsed the hanging. Elias heard this secondhand from Walt, who reported it with the guilty look of a man who knows he's delivering bad news but can't quite bring himself not to. "She said that," Elias said. "More or less," Walt said. "Also some things about the age difference. You know how Clara gets?" "I know how Clara gets," Elias said. He went back to work. He told himself it didn't matter, which was partially true. Clara Hooper's opinion had never been something he organized his life around. But there was something else underneath the dismissal, something that had been there since the beginning, sitting quiet in the back of his chest like a stone he hadn't moved yet. She deserved better, didn't she? Didn't. Not better as in more. He wasn't modest to the point of stupidity, but better as in different. A man with time ahead of him instead of time behind. A man who wasn't going to be old when she was still young, older when she was in her prime, dead, possibly, when she was still only in her middle years. He was 58. She was 29. The numbers were simply the numbers, and he could not make them smaller by ignoring them. He thought about this for 3 days. Then he went back to see her because he couldn't make himself not go back, and he hated himself a little for that. The inability to behave rationally about something that deserved rationality. She had made a stew, which was considerably better than anything he'd made in years, and they ate together at her small table with the books crowding in from all sides. And she told him about a student, a boy named Marcus, whose home situation she was worried about, which she described carefully without identifying him too specifically, clearly protective of the child's privacy even in a private conversation, and asked him, not expecting a particular answer, what he thought she should do. He thought about it, really thought about it, which was what she was actually asking him to do. Not the reflexive answer, the actual answer. "Don't wait for it to get worse," he said finally. "These things only go one direction if nobody says anything." She was quiet for a moment. "You sound like you know." "I've seen it, on the ranches. Men who should have spoken up earlier." He looked at his bowl. "Silence isn't always neutral." She nodded slowly. "I'll talk to the Hendersons," she said. "They're his aunt and uncle. They're decent." "They are," he said. "Go to them directly. Don't go through the school board first." She made a small sound of agreement, and then she said, "You think about things carefully." He looked up. She was watching him in that direct way. "Not always," he said. "More than most people," she said, not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation she was sharing for accuracy's sake. He went home that night thinking about the stone in his chest and the numbers, and Clara Hooper's voice, and the way Vivian had said you think about things carefully, like it was a fact she'd documented rather than praise she was offering. He went home. He did not sleep well. He went back anyway the following week. By November's end, the watching had become something with texture. People acknowledged it differently, which told him something about people. The Greers were careful with him. Not cold, but careful, the way people are when they think you might be doing something that's going to end badly, and they don't want to be the ones who encouraged it. Old Pastor Michaels said nothing specific, but made a point of shaking his hand warmly at the edge of a conversation about the Thornton fence line, which Elias interpreted as either approval or misdirection, and couldn't tell which. Several men he barely knew made comments of the nudging variety, knowing looks, half smiles, the unspoken assumption that whatever was happening out at the ranch was a kind of amusement. He hated the amusement most. Not because it shamed him. He was 58 years old and had been minding his own business for all of them. And he was not going to rearrange his life around the entertainment requirements of men who'd known him for 20 years and still couldn't remember what he took in his coffee. He hated it because it was cheap, because it reduced something that felt, whatever it was, he wasn't naming it yet, to something that could be smirked at. He mentioned none of this to Vivian. She mentioned it first. It was the first week of December, cold enough now that the ground was frozen solid, and the horse's breath hung in visible clouds when he worked them in the mornings. She'd come out to the ranch to return a book she'd borrowed, a historical account of the fur trade he'd lent her from the small collection on his parlor shelf. And they'd ended up in the kitchen with coffee, which had not been the plan but which happened anyway because she'd looked cold, and he'd said, "Do you want coffee?" without thinking about it. "People are talking," she said directly, not preamble. He looked at her. "I know. Does it bother you?" He turned his cup in his hands. "In what sense?" "In the sense of whether you want to stop coming out here." She said it evenly, but there was something underneath it. She was watching him more carefully than usual. "Or stop having me come to the ranch, if it's making things difficult for you." He understood what she was asking, whether he wanted the protection of distance, whether the talk was the kind that threatened his standing, his reputation, the things a man protects in a small community because they're what he has. "No," he said, "it doesn't bother me that way." "What way does it bother you?" He was quiet for a moment. This was where he would normally leave it, give enough answer to stop the question without giving the actual answer. He'd been doing that his whole life about certain things, and it had served him, and he was very nearly 59 years old, and the habit was deeply worn in. "It bothers me," he said slowly, "because some of what they're saying isn't wrong." She frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "The age." He stopped, tried again. "You're 29. I'm 58. That's not nothing." "I'm aware of the arithmetic," she said, and there was a sharpness in it that surprised him. "I know you are. I'm not saying you're not." "Then what are you saying?" He looked at her. She was watching him with the direct eyes and a quality of patience that was not quite patience, more like the stillness before a decision. He had the sense that whatever he said in the next 30 seconds would matter, and he also had the sense that he was going to say the wrong thing, because he almost always said the wrong thing when it counted. "I'm saying," he said carefully, "that it's an easier thing to dismiss at a distance than it is to dismiss when you're sitting across from it." Silence. "Sitting across from what, specifically?" she said. He met her eyes. "The difference in where we are," he said. "In time. In what's ahead." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that he thought he'd managed to offend her, which was not what he'd intended, or rather, it was partly what he'd intended, but not in the way that would lead anywhere good. "Do you think," she said finally, measured, "that I haven't considered that?" "I think you're 29, he said, "and I think at 29 it's possible to know something without knowing what it means." "That's almost insulting," she said. "I know," he said. "I'm not sure how else to say it." She looked at the table. She looked back at him. Whatever she was deciding, she took her time deciding it. "Elias," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his first name, and something about it landed differently in his chest than expected. "I've been sitting in rooms with people my entire adult life who made decisions about what I could and couldn't understand. I've been told I was too young, too inexperienced, too idealistic, too female, too educated for a woman, not educated enough for a man, too forward, too reserved." She paused. "I'm reasonably tired of it." He said nothing. "I'm not saying there isn't something real in what you're pointing at," she said. "I'm saying I'm capable of seeing it myself. And I'm saying—" She stopped. Something shifted in her face, not retreat, but recalibration. "I'm saying I don't need you to protect me from a thing I can see clearly." He sat with that. "You're right," he said finally. She picked up her coffee cup. Her hands were steady. "I know," she said, and she was not unkind about it, but she was not soft about it either, and he found that he didn't want her to be. They talked about this book for a while after that. The fur trade, the roots, the impossible winters the early trappers had endured, and whether the accounts could be believed or whether memory improved under the pressure of a good story. She had opinions about primary sources that were more sophisticated than his, and she was willing to argue them, which he appreciated in a way he hadn't anticipated appreciating. He drove home in the dark. The stone in his chest was still there, but it felt different now. Less like something blocking the way, and more like something he was going to have to pick up and look at eventually, one way or another. December moved through Harlan County with the thoroughness of a creditor collecting what it was owed. The cold was not scenic Montana cold. It was operational cold, the kind that dictated what you could and couldn't do and required your full professional attention if you intended to keep livestock alive and pipes unfrozen and firewood stocked enough to last. Elias worked harder in December than any other month, which was saying something because he worked hard in all of them. He still went to see her. He brought her firewood the second week because he'd been out cutting his own and had cut considerably more than he needed, which was not something he'd planned. And she accepted it without making it into a moment, which he was grateful for. And they stacked it together on her porch while she told him about a student who'd finally, after weeks of frustrating resistance, cracked the particular problem in mathematics that had been stopping him. And the satisfaction in her voice was the satisfaction of a person who does their work because they care about it, not because they're required to. And he stood listening to her in the cold and thought about how long it had been since he'd been in the company of someone who cared about something the way she cared about this. Ruth had cared like that, about the garden, about the neighbors, about the particular project of making a life work in a place that made life difficult. He hadn't thought about Ruth in that way for a long time. Not the grief of her, which was its own familiar texture, but the quality of her, the specific thing she'd been. The thought arrived without warning, and he stood with the firewood in his arms and felt it, just felt it, without trying to move past it. Elias? He looked up. Vivian was watching him, stack of wood in her own arms. Sorry, he said. Somewhere else. It's all right. She turned to stack her portion and then said, without looking at him, Were you thinking about your wife? He was quiet for a moment. Yes. What was she like? Nobody had asked him that in years. They asked how she died sometimes. They said she must have been a wonderful woman. They said they were sorry for his loss with the specific formulaic sadness of people completing a social obligation. They did not ask what she was like. He told her. Standing there in the December cold with the firewood stacked between them and the sky doing something complicated with gray and silver above the mountains, he told her about Ruth. Ruth who was funny in a dry way that crept up on you. Ruth who was an indifferent cook and had never once apologized for it. Ruth who kept a garden in conditions that should not have supported a garden purely through force of will and a willingness to argue with the soil. Ruth who had opinions about weather and other people's business that she mostly kept to herself except when she didn't. Ruth who had a way of putting her hand on his shoulder when he came in from a bad day that communicated without a single word that the bad day was over. He talked until his own voice surprised him, and he stopped. She sounds like someone who is very much herself, Vivian said. She was, he said. She was exactly herself, all the time. She nodded, and there was something in the nod that was recognition rather than sympathy. That's rare, she said. It is, he said. They went inside for coffee, which he'd stopped refusing, and they talked until it was genuinely dark outside. And when he finally rode home, he was cold in the way that comes from being still too long. But the other cold, the one that lived in the quiet of the house, was less present than usual. He did not name the thing that was happening. He was a practical man, and practical men do not name things before they're sure of what the names mean. He told himself he was doing this, whatever it was, for the reasons that he had, which were real reasons. She was interesting, she was good company, the winter was long, the house was quiet. He told himself that. He was 58 years old, and he had been telling himself approximately this thing for 6 weeks. And he was starting to notice that the telling wasn't taking the way it should. He was starting to notice, which was the dangerous part. The wind off the mountains was something that night, and he rode into it with his head down and his coat tight, and somewhere in the dark between her place and his, he had a thought that came in clear and sudden and without permission. I am happier when I am with her than I am the rest of the time. He put the horse up. He went inside. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while. That was the thing. That was the shape of it. He'd been trying not to see it, and now that he'd seen it, he wasn't sure which direction to walk in. The problem with small towns was not the people in them. It was the density of the people in them. The way everyone occupied the same compressed geography until their lives became inevitably, unavoidably entangled. and the entanglement meant that what happened to one person happened, in some diluted but real sense, to everyone within a 5-mile radius, whether they wanted it to or not. Elias understood this. He had lived in Harlan County for 30 years, and he had watched it operate with the consistency of a natural law. What he had not fully accounted for was what it felt like to be on the inside of it rather than the outside, to be the thing being watched instead of one of the watchers. January came in hard and stayed hard. The temperature dropped to places that made outdoor work a negotiation between necessity and survival, and Elias spent the first 2 weeks of the new year managing the damage. A section of the north pasture fence that the ice had collapsed, a heating issue in the barn that threatened 2 of the horses before he caught it, a water line to the main house that froze at a joint he'd patched 3 years ago and clearly should have replaced. He worked from before dawn until the cold made his hands stop cooperating, and then he went inside and ate whatever was quickest and slept and did it again. He didn't see Vivian for 19 days. He didn't let himself think too carefully about what it meant that he was counting them. When the weather broke enough to make the road passable, he drove into town for supplies and ran into her outside Halverson's almost exactly the way he'd nearly run her over with the wagon 4 months earlier, except this time no horses were involved, and he was on foot and she was coming out of the store as he was going in, and they almost walked directly into each other. 19 days, she said, and then looked briefly surprised at herself for saying it. He looked at her. She looked back at him, and there was something that passed across her face. Not embarrassment. Vivian Hartwell did not embarrass easily, but something like the acknowledgement that she'd shown more of her hand than she'd intended. The fence line came down, he said, and then the barn, and then the water pipe. I know, she said. Walt told me. Of course, Walt had told her. Walt told everyone everything with the dedicated thoroughness of a man who believed information was meant to be distributed rather than held. How are your students? He said. Cold and restless, she said. Same as everyone. She shifted the package she was carrying. I missed the conversation, she said more quietly, and she said it plainly, not as admission of something she'd been debating whether to say, just as fact, the way she said most things. The ranch kept you busy. It did, he said. He paused. There were people moving on the boardwalk around them, not paying attention, or paying attention and pretending not to. I'll come out Saturday, he said, if that's all right. Saturday's fine, she said. He went in and got his supplies and came back out, and she was gone, and he stood at the wagon for a moment longer than he needed to before he climbed up and headed home. He came on Saturday. She had made coffee that was genuinely good, better than it had been in the fall, and when he said so, she told him she'd been practicing, which made something complicated happen in the vicinity of his sternum. They sat in the parlor with the books and the lamp and the cold pressing at the windows, and it was as if the 19 days had been a pause rather than a gap. The conversation picked up with the ease of something that had been set down carefully rather than interrupted. She was reading a book about the geological history of the Northern Rockies, which she'd ordered from a catalog, and which had arrived with 2 pages stuck together and a water stain on the cover that suggested an interesting journey. She told him about the glacial formations, and he told her about a section of the ranch where the rock came up in a way that the old-timers had always called odd, and she got up and found the relevant chapter and showed him that the old-timers had been right. It was odd, and it was odd for a reason that involved ice from a very long time ago, moving very slowly and doing what ice does when it moves. He looked at the page and he looked at her face, which was lit with the specific animation of a person who has found a fact that connects 2 previously unconnected things. And he thought about the 19 days and the counting and the I missed the conversation said plainly without armor, and he thought, this is getting away from me. The thought was not panicked. It was more like a man standing on a slope realizing he has been walking downhill without noticing. And now the grade is steep enough that stopping requires more effort than continuing, and continuing leads somewhere he hasn't decided whether he's going. He went home and he made himself think about it directly, which was not his natural inclination, but which seemed necessary. He sat at the kitchen table, the same table, the bad coffee, the left side of the bed he didn't look at, and he laid it out as clearly as he could. He was developing feelings for Vivian Hartwell. This was real. He was not going to pretend otherwise to himself, because pretending to yourself was, in his experience, the least efficient form of pretending, and also the most corrosive. He was 58 years old. She was 29. He was a widower with a working ranch and no particular future he could point to that contained growth or expansion. She was a young woman of considerable intelligence and capability who had years of possibility stretching in every direction. The gap between those two realities was not romantic. It was mathematical. And yet, he sat with the "and yet" for a long time. The fire burned down and he didn't rebuild it, and the kitchen got cold around him, and he sat in the cold and thought about Ruth and what she would have said about this, which he couldn't know, but which he suspected would have been characteristically Ruth about it, which meant direct, slightly amused, and containing an insight he wouldn't have reached on his own. He didn't know what to do, so he did what he always did when he didn't know what to do, which was to go to work in the morning and let the problem sit. The problem, unfortunately, did not stay sat. It was Clara Hooper who escalated things, which was not surprising because Clara Hooper had been escalating things since approximately 1871 and showed no signs of stopping. The particular escalation happened at the monthly gathering of the women's charitable organization that met at the church hall, at which Maybelle Greer was present, and at which Clara said things that Maybelle was too loyal not to report to Walt, who was too Walt not to eventually, reluctantly, tell Elias. "She's saying it's not just inappropriate," Walt said. He was looking at the floor of Elias's barn, which was where Elias had been when Walt arrived, and which seemed to have become the default location for difficult conversations this winter. "She's saying the school board ought to know about it, that it reflects badly on the school to have the teacher spending so much time out at a widower's ranch." Elias went on forking hay for a moment. "She's saying Vivian's reputation is going to suffer," Walt continued unhappily, "and that any woman with that much education ought to know better." "Claire's been talking about other people's education since before she had any of her own," Elias said. "I know that, but Elias—" Walt stopped, tried again. "She's not wrong that people are paying attention, and some of the school board members listen to her. Henderson does, for sure." "Henderson's a reasonable man," Elias said. "Henderson's a reasonable man who has an unreasonable wife who is friendly with Clara Hooper." Elias put down the pitchfork. He looked at Walt, who looked back with the genuine discomfort of a man who cares about his friend and has no clean solution to offer. "Is Vivian's position at risk?" Elias said. Walt was quiet for a beat too long. "Walt, I don't know," Walt said. "Probably not. But there's been talk about whether her conduct is appropriate for a school teacher. And in this county, talk has a way of becoming reality if enough people repeat it." Elias picked the pitchfork back up. He went back to the hay. "I'll think about it," he said. Walt left, and Elias stood in the barn with the horses and the smell of hay and manure and cold wood and thought about Vivian Hartwell's position at the school, which she had come to Harlan County specifically to build, in a place specifically chosen to be away from whatever she was leaving. He thought about how hard she'd worked for the education she had. He thought about the boy Marcus and the way she'd protected his privacy, even in a private conversation. He thought about how she'd said, "I don't need you to protect me from a thing I can see clearly." And then he thought about whether the problem was that he was protecting her or that he was protecting himself. That thought landed differently. He went to see her the following week, and he said nothing about any of it. He sat in the parlor with the books and the good coffee, and he listened to her talk about a proposal she was drafting to the school board for an expanded curriculum, mathematics through basic algebra, some natural science, possibly a reading program for the older girls who didn't have access to books at home. And her face while she talked about it was the face of a person who has found their work and knows it, and he sat with the stone in his chest and the thought he'd had in the barn and said nothing. The saying nothing was a choice. He was aware it was a choice. He was also aware that he was making it because he didn't know the right thing to do yet. And his instinct, when he didn't know the right thing to do, was to not do the wrong thing while he figured it out. This strategy had served him reasonably well for 58 years. It had also, on at least 2 occasions he could name, meant he'd waited too long and missed something that wouldn't come back. He was trying to figure out which kind of situation this was. "You're quiet tonight," Vivian said, midway through her explanation of the algebra proposal. "I'm listening," he said. "You're listening differently than usual," she said. She said it without accusation, just observation, the way she usually made observations, as information being offered rather than weapons being deployed. "I've got something on my mind," he said. She waited. He looked at her. The lamplight, the books, the cold pressing at the windows, her face direct and unhurried. "Have you heard anything from the school board?" he said. "About anything." She was still for a moment. Then something shifted in her expressions. Not surprise, but the specific quality of a person who has known something was coming and had been waiting to see which direction it came from. "Henderson spoke to me," she said. "Last week." He felt something tighten in his chest. "What did he say?" "He said there had been some concern expressed about my socializing." She said the word with a precise flatness that communicated clearly what she thought of it. "He was actually quite decent about it. He said he personally had no concerns, but he wanted me to be aware that some community members, Clara Hooper, he didn't say who." She looked at her hands on the table. He said the nature of the concerns was that frequent visits to a widower's property, unaccompanied, might create a perception that was, his word, distracting to the community. Elias said nothing. "I told him," Vivian said, "that I was not in the habit of adjusting my friendships based on what Clara Hooper found distracting." "You said Clara Hooper." He said he hadn't said who. "I said I was aware of that." The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. He didn't argue the point. Elias looked at the table. He looked at the lamp. He looked at the way the shadows moved at the edge of the room. "I don't want your position here threatened," he said. "I know you don't," she said. "If my coming here—" "Elias," her voice was even but firm. "I made the same calculation you're making about 5 seconds ago, and I came to the same place Henderson did, which is that I'm not going to be managed by social pressure I don't respect into giving up something I do respect." She paused. "The question isn't whether I want you to stop coming. I don't. The question is what we're doing." The room was very quiet. He'd known the question was there. He'd been not looking at it for 2 months, which was his particular talent, and she'd just named it with the direct precision that was entirely characteristic of her. And now it was named and sitting on the table between them, and he couldn't move it or cover it or walk past it. "I don't know how to answer that," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for an answer tonight. I'm saying the question is there." "It's there," he said. "Yes." He went home that night with the question riding with him in the dark, which it would continue to do for the rest of the winter because that was the kind of question it was, the kind that doesn't wait politely in place while you decide how to approach it. The kind that follows you into the barn in the morning and sits across the kitchen table at night and waits. February brought a brief thaw that fooled nobody, followed by another hard freeze that seemed almost personally motivated. Elias worked the fence lines and kept the animals alive and drove into town when he needed to. And each time he saw Vivian, twice in February, 3 times in March, as the worst of the cold began finally and grudgingly to relent. The question was there with them in the room, not uncomfortable exactly, but present. They talked about books and students and the ranch and the spring that was coming eventually, whether the evidence for it was currently visible or not. She told him more about her family, her father's opinions about the railroad and the government and the nature of progress, which were numerous and passionately held and had apparently dominated many dinners of her childhood. He told her about the early years on the ranch, before Ruth, when he'd been young enough to think that difficulty was temporary and stupidity was someone else's problem, which it turned out was not accurate on either count. She laughed at that. The real laugh, the sudden one, the one that she didn't modulate for an audience. He had started to think of that laugh as something that was only possible at a certain level of comfort, the kind of comfort that built slowly and couldn't be performed or rushed. He was starting to understand that he had been building something without noticing he was building it, and now it existed, and it had the specific, solid weight of something real. One evening in early March, sitting with the bad coffee he'd made at the ranch, she'd come out to return another borrowed book and the cold had again delayed the leaving. She said, abruptly, in the middle of a silence that had been comfortable until it wasn't, "I was engaged before I came here." He looked up. "In Billings," she said. She was looking at the lamp rather than at him. "His name was Garrett. He was, by any reasonable standard, he was exactly what made sense. His family had money. He was educated. He was kind, actually, genuinely kind, which matters more than people acknowledge when they're young." She paused. "Everyone who knew us assumed we would marry." Elias sat very still and listened. "I called it off 8 months before I came here," she said. We were 6 weeks from the wedding date. She finally looked at him. Her face was steady, but the steadiness had cost something. Everyone was, the word I'd use is devastated. His family, my family, the people who'd been planning and anticipating and treating it as settled. She exhaled slowly. I was the one who wasn't settled, and I couldn't make myself do it anyway. What was missing? He said. She was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted. Outside, the wind was doing something with the barn door that would need checking before morning. I don't know if I can name it cleanly, she said. It wasn't that anything was wrong. It was that when I tried to picture the life, the actual daily life, the years of it, I felt nothing. Not unhappy, nothing. Just blank. And I thought, she stopped. I thought that blank was what I was supposed to feel, that the grand, passionate feeling was something people invented for novels. And then I thought about doing it for the rest of my life, feeling blank. And I couldn't. Elias turned his cup in his hands. I broke his heart, she said, matter-of-factly. I broke my father's sense of what was possible for me. I left everything I'd built there and came somewhere that had no connection to any of it. She looked at him directly. I'm telling you this because you've told me things I think you don't usually tell people, and I wanted... She stopped. I wanted you to have it, the context. He understood what she was giving him, not just the information, the trust that came with it, the specific weight of a story that had cost something to carry and cost something to set down. I'm glad you left, he said. She blinked. It was the first time he'd ever seen her caught off guard by something he'd said. That's not... She started, and then she stopped, and something in her face changed in a way he couldn't entirely read, but which felt like it mattered. That's not what I expected you to say. What did you expect? Something more, measured, she said. Something about understanding your reasons and respecting your courage. Those things are also true, he said. But I'm glad you left. Specifically. She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back, and the question that had been sitting on the table between them since January was still there, still waiting, but it had changed shape slightly. It was less abstract now, less theoretical, more like something with edges and weight and specific dimensions. Neither of them said anything more about it that night, but when she left and he watched her wagon move down the road toward town, the last of the winter light going silver and thin over the mountains behind her, Elias Thornton stood on the porch of the house he had lived in alone for 11 years and felt, clearly and without confusion, something he recognized. It wasn't the comfort of a habit. It wasn't the warmth of company in a long winter. It was specific to her, to the way she said things, and the things she said, and the laugh, and the direct eyes, and the courage it had taken to leave Billings and the algebra proposal, and the geological history of the Rockies, and the fact that she'd been counting the 19 days, too. He stood on the porch until he was genuinely cold. Then he went inside.